Yo, what's up? It's the Fight Site MMA podcast. This is the regular crew. We've had guests a bunch of weeks in a row, but just for the record, the regular crew is Sriram and myself. Sriram's the host. I help.
Well, you're also a host since you're regular now.
We are co-lead hosts. We are both co-hosts, if however you want to call it. So, you know, good news or bad news, depending on if you like us. Recently, we were told we need to find our personalities, and it's actually very difficult when you've been yourself your whole life to find a different self to be on air. So
I'm going to steal something from my accounting professor and say the start of my personality is everyone has to call me "Oh Captain, my captain."
See, who wouldn't like this guy? I just don't understand it.
I don't like me.
But yeah, if you don't like us, then don't listen. There's some advice for you right there. Okay, but yeah, this podcast is actually about fights, not about us, as much as some people apparently want it to be. And it's a really good fight, the one that we're going to talk about. This will be out after our prediction panel came out. I highly doubt we'll be able to top the analytical content of that one, just because that's 4 analysts, each getting space to break down each fighter and the fight and the matchup and whatever else. So that's why we do that format, is because it's awesome for covering this kind of content. But we're going to take a stab at it again. And this is Sriram's second time talking about the fight in as many days. So he's going to be sharp as hell. And I have nothing good to say about this fight. So it's going to be interesting. But
I strongly disagree.
Oh, we'll see. To help us out, we have our special guest panelist with us. It's Dan Albert, and I'll say where you might know him from after he introduces himself, just so I don't do any overlapping. But Dan, hello, how are you? Tell the people who you are if they don't know you.
I am the person now formerly known as Dan Albert. You see, the backstory here is they all miss the other Dan or Martin, whatever his name is, but they couldn't find a good replacement, so they got an uglier one, yours truly, here for the task. And although I can't probably live up to his good name, I will do my best. Mostly
monopoly on Dan's.
Whoa, yeah. Otherwise, I don't really have anything interesting to say about myself. You can just find me on Twitter, where I do one of 5 things, but sometimes I write articles about fight breakdowns and stuff, and I'm okay at it.
I think you're pretty good. And he
thank
also
you.
talks
Yeah,
about
co-sign
video
that.
games at a very analytical, technical level, which I can't do, and lots of other cool topics. So Dan's a good follow. Definitely follow Dan, and he publishes his own breakdowns, and he's done guest posts on the fight site, and there will be more collaboration to come. And we definitely respect Dan's giant brain. We find all these brain geniuses on Twitter, and we take them into our circle, and we exploit their labor. And it's just it's a great little system we have here. And just to refute your uglier Dan comment, well, it's true that very few people can live up to Danny Martin's beauty. You are not ugly, so uglier perhaps. But
and also, you're probably more positive about Calvin Kattar, which is what I call inner beauty.
The main reason you're here is so we can have a Kattar positive Dan.
Okay. I wouldn't call me the most positive person in the world, but I promise to disappoint.
Nice. Yeah. Speaking of Danny, it's such a shame because there has been a Kattar specific podcast with Danny Martin on it in the past in this podcast. But, just in the biggest fight of his career, it's such a shame not to have Danny Martin here, because Danny Martin is the biggest Kattar hater I've ever witnessed in my life. I don't know where it came from. I think I do know where it came from, actually.
Yeah, I know where it came from.
And he has this thing where he invests in a fighter. He sees them and he likes them. He likes what they do. And then he decides that they need to live up to the highest standard possible. And if they're even a little bit less than he thought they were, then they are bad and actually terrible and would lose to anyone who can kick. And that's kind of what happened with that whole Kattar thing. So yeah, he's just been raging against him for a long time. So we're just gonna keep Danny's memory alive by talking about all the fighters he hates every time it comes up. But let's swerve into the positive direction. So just a little bit of background on this fight. It's Max Holloway versus Calvin Kattar. It's the main event. This fight's going to be on ABC, which is pretty cool. Cable networks on a small number channel. I think it's like one of the first 5 channels. I don't know. But yeah, it's going to get a lot of eyes on it. Unfortunately, the rest of the card is super weak sounding. I cannot predict what the fights will be like, but just, not using any established forces out there besides the co-main event, which is complicated and we'll get to. So yeah, definitely a huge slot here for Holloway and Kattar, also coming off of a really long break in the fights. So I think, fans who are already part of the base are going to be looking forward to it. Like, oh, finally the UFC is back and everyone's on board, no fatigue, ready to go. We'll see how our fatigue is by the end of the card. But, heading into the event, we're pretty psyched. So this is a weird one for Max Holloway. It's his first non-title fight since 2016. Yeah, the Ricardo Lamas fight was the last time Holloway didn't fight for a title. His Pettis was for an interim title, then he won the title off Aldo, 2 defenses, interim title fight with Poirier, defended his title against Edgar, and then 2 title fights straight with Volkanovski. It's also his first fight since 2019, not against Alexander Volkanovski, which is a fresh matchup. Volkanovski, I'm sure, is extremely frustrating to fight, so it'll be nice to have somebody a little bit different, albeit more dangerous in some ways. Not better, but more dangerous.
Yeah, not as tricky, but
yeah, a strange matchup for sure. So that fight was in July, so a nice timed turnaround for Holloway. And then for Kattar, kind of a weird spot, just because he kind of activityed himself into being a top contender, which, I mean, I love that. I love that Kattar is a top contender, but he didn't actually beat anyone ranked high to do it. We were always really high on him when he beat Andre Fili, but Andre Fili was a great debut win in the Shane Burgos fight. Both these guys, I think Dan has written about that fight before, but both those guys showed, a very high level of striking for MMA, and it was also very exciting. And Kattar, really announced himself with that one. A little disappointing with the Moicano fight, just because Moicano had his number, more or less, was able to exploit everything that was wrong with his game. Beats Chris Fishgold. That's a hard name to say. I had to get ready for that. And then the Lamas knockout was a big deal for a lot of people, just because Lamas has been highly ranked for a long time, and it was a very emphatic way to knock him out. I think it was just a 1-2, but it was gorgeous.
3-2,
yeah,
around the side.
So that got a lot of attention. Then he got put in another high profile matchup. So the OC really, I think, has been investing in him pretty much right off the bat. As soon as he gets a big win, they give him a big spot, a big chance to do something for his career. Dropped the ball twice now, I would say. It's his 2 biggest matchups he's lost so far. The Zabit fight was weird. Tosi just dropped the ball down the stairs. The Zabit fight was weird because he did look a little lost at times, but then came on super strong in the third. And as I predicted, because I'm so smart, he was very hard to wrestle and, disproved a lot of people's theories about that fight, except for mine, because I'm a genius. So now we find ourselves with Kattar on another 2-fight win streak. The Jeremy Stephens fight, I thought, was a really great performance from him, because he, he had to deal with kicking, and Stephens looked like, the best kicker he's ever been. And Kattar didn't seem to have that much of a problem with it, and countered Stephens' entries. And I think we'll get to it a little bit, but I think that also addresses some of the things that people say about Kattar. And then the Dan Ige fight, honestly, I don't remember anything about it. So let's start with this. The evolution of Kattar's game, you might call it, from where he was, let's call it, 2 years ago to where he is now. Hello, Toasty. How do you guys feel about Kattar? Do you think he's developing in his game? Because there's this narrative that fighters who are deep into their careers, as Kattar is, don't really change that much.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think he just is who he is at this point, honestly. Like, I think it's mostly been a function of the match. Like, Kattar's actually a super weird case, because he pretty much walked into the UFC a finished product, top 10 at least fighter, and you could like kind of tell by the way he beat Andre Fili, who was like underranked for the longest time. And obviously the Burgos fight, it's just like he's run into tough matchups, but those tough matchups would also be tough for like a lot of fighters up at the top. So he's just now hitting the point where he's ranked somewhat appropriately. But yeah, I don't really think that he's improving necessarily. And I think the way that he kind of looks at fights means that he's not going to be making any huge leaps in terms of what he does. But what I do think is that we're seeing more of his skill set against opponents who work better into it. Like, for instance, when we saw the Moicano fight, we were like, oh, Kattar can't deal with kicks whatsoever. He's so bad. Oh, my God. And then you see him against someone who's a little bit worse at kicking, and someone like Jeremy Stevens. And Kattar just kind of checked his kicks, outkicked him. Didn't really punish the kicks, but at least, had some idea what to do with them. So I think it's less that Kattar's improving and more that he walked into a Shark Tank and we're learning more about how he deals with different parts of it.
When I was rewatching Kattar's career over the last week, a few things stood out to me. I think in some regards there are some improvements that he's made, specifically in trying to push kind of his pocket game a little more. I do think, for all intents and purposes, his offensive ring craft still leaves much to be desired. Specifically, like in terms of following guys and trying not to specifically create entries off that lead hand. But the main thing I've seen is how he started like manipulating the center line a lot more with how he creates offense. Now, mind you, I think part of the reason he gets away with it so much now is due to like certain, I guess the word would be depth to kind of who he's fighting. Because like when you look at like Stevens, Ige, and Zabit, etc., like they don't exactly have the most static, like effective, versatile guards or head movement in the world. So typically, like Kattar can kind of create more entries off of that. But another thing I've noticed is that Kattar has started turning his opponents more off the center line and attacking with hooks first instead of that jab. And usually he's firing a lot more typically. Now, whether or not that's the thing that's going to really like get him far, probably not. But I think he's improved to some regard. But I think he's a very good fighter, but he's not as good as it feels like he should be. And there's just several issues to that. But I think like there's a bunch of like overlying reasons for it. And I think interestingly, like he always poses an interesting kind of juxtaposition to Burgos, I think, because you have like two very talented guys and kind of two different like mentalities as technicians. And yet it kind of seems like they kind of try to get by, or at least their team kind of lets them get by just upon like them having an inherent advantage in like their respective like skills, I guess. I suppose like there are a bunch of questions going into this about like how much improvements he's made, whether or not that's going to make a difference. But I definitely think there are some things he is getting better at, or at least trying to fix. He's just probably not allocating it according to his opponents effectively.
Here's my really simplistic summary of some of the things I thought you said. Would you say it's fair that instead of like, broadening his game or filling in any major gaps people identified, he's strengthening his strengths? He's getting better at the areas he's already good at?
I'd say
his own strategies?
Yeah, I think like he's trying to refine some things. I don't think he's refined it though. Like I can say he's refining some things to try to push them a little more, but I don't think he's at the point where he needs to be though, or like at least should be, where it kind of makes it easier to like see him fight guys who are kind of equipped to beat him or give him trouble.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And before, go ahead.
Oh no. Yeah, I think I kind of struggle with that because I think the way that Kattar came into the UFC and his second fight being Shane Burgos, who's very, very good, but also works into his game perfectly, I think it's kind of set like an artificial ceiling on how much we think that like where he should be. Where I think, like for instance, like we see someone who's really, really sharp mechanically, he's incredibly sharp even tactically off his own jab. He's fantastic on the counter, and we see like he should be very, very good in like an all-terrain fighter. And I think we kind of underestimate how few true all-terrain fighters exist. Now he's fighting one of them this weekend. Max Holloway is genuinely one of the most versatile fighters I've ever seen in the sport, period. But the reason a performance like Michael Johnson versus Edson Barboza is so shocking to me is because people don't tend to do that. If someone wants to move backwards, they move backwards, and they're not good moving forwards. So I guess the point that I'm making is that I think Calvin Kattar kind of is who he's meant to be. And I think he can beat a lot more fighters than people think just based, like, for instance, like Danny Gay, he fought a fairly sharp fight, in my opinion. He attacked certain points of Kattar's game, such as the dislike of moving forward and the high guard, and that he drew Kattar forward and attacked with body hit combinations and the blitzes. That if Kattar was not as good as he was supposed to be, I think he wouldn't have been able to deal with that. But he was able to beat a bad matchup just by being that good. And I think that's like an inelegant way to deal with fights. Like Alexander Volkanovski would never be like, I'm just this good. I'll just deal with it the way I deal with it and not deal with you. But it's also kind of proof that he's that good, like genuinely, if that makes sense.
Maybe it makes sense. As we've learned recently, I am too stupid. Like once you get like past 2 sentences, I'm like, I don't know if I follow you anymore.
Disagree.
But yeah, all good things being said. And again, like I don't have any real memory of the Danny Gay fight, so I can't confirm nor deny anything about it. So talking about Max a little bit more, same kind of premise. You know what his trajectory is like. I'm not going to go all the way through his career, but you know, just in recent memory, I think we all had a pretty good idea of who he was. You know, around the Aldo and Pettis fights, which are very different fights. You know, very different opponents, extremely different approaches. Max showing off different parts of his game against both of them. Huge gap of time, 1 year between Aldo 2 and Ortega. And if people remember, that was when in that time period, it might have been like October or something.
It was like July.
Yeah, it was like summerish, late summerish. Yeah. Max was gonna step in and fight Khabib. He's gonna replace Tony, and he was like giving interviews or something like that, doing some official media, and he was slurring his speech and he wasn't looking so good. And Bisping was questioning it, and I think they pulled him from the fight, like they didn't let him weigh in or something like that. He wasn't deemed fit to continue. And the theory at the time was like he had a stroke or something like that. It was really tough. And people were really questioning if this was the end of his career or at least the end of his time as an elite fighter. And I remember that being a very plausible theory, just because it looked really bad. It looked really bad. And some people said, "Oh, he's just Hawaiian. He's not slurring," which I thought was in poor taste at the time. In hindsight, it's very funny, but it still might be in poor taste. Anyway, he came back in December and he just beat the crap out of Brian Ortega. Like, did not get hit very much, did not look like he was at all physically bothered, and just battered him. And, you know, going into that fight, the analyst community, I don't think anyone doubted that he was going to do that if he was him. We just weren't sure if he was going to be him. So we didn't really learn anything new about him as a fighter at the time, but we were like, okay, Max is still Max. And then he fought Dustin Poirier and took probably the most damage he ever has in any single fight in his career, just because of Poirier's power, counterpunching, and the rest of his game. And at that point, we're like, okay, I remember from before when we thought his career might be over because of, you know, perhaps brain damage related things. Now maybe this is the end. He got a very favorable matchup next against Frankie Edgar. That was like a blessing just because I think we wanted other people to get the title shot at the time. But Edgar really was a blessing just because that's someone that at this point in his career is not hitting you that hard. And is also, you know, not that great at getting to you to hit you. And if he's going to pursue a game plan, it's probably going to involve a lot of wrestling, which is, it's all very forgiving. And we thought, okay, this is going to be a litmus test for where Max is on his way back. Where is he physically? That's always been our question, really, the past, you know, 2 years of this narrative is where is Max physically? We didn't really have any doubts about his game causing him any problems, except for a little bit in the Poirier fight. But, you know, a lot of people just chalk that up to the size, going up to lightweight. The Edgar fight was weird because that was a fight where he really could have afforded to be aggressive and do exactly what he did to Ortega, really. But he was much more conservative and he took the back foot and he wasn't exactly countering Edgar. He was countering Edgar a little bit, but he was just, you know, taking some steps back, letting Edgar close the distance, then starting his combinations that way. Also, you know, letting Edgar have to close the distance for his own takedowns, and whizzing off and doing all the tall guy defensive wrestling things that he's very good at. And he looked good in that fight. He won comfortably. It's just, we thought that should have been a blowout at the time, and we're worried that this is new defensive Max, and this is how he's going to be. So that brings us into the fights against Alexander Volkanovski, and I'm definitely going to pass it off to Dan Albert because Dan has been studying these fights religiously and, just ruining his mind, intensely, going over these fights. But, along this narrative, with regard to Max, what happened in those two fights? What was the progression? What did we learn?
Okay, so I want to start out with a quick defense that I did not watch these fights 49 times because I am a genuine obsessive compulsive person. I did, on the other hand, have a ridiculous amount of notes though. Okay, so basically I'm going to try to do a TLDR version of this and fail emphatically. Okay, so fight number one, basically I'm of the opinion that basically Volkanovski figured out that dealing with Holloway involves like preventing his kind of entries and kind of exploiting like his kind of not so great offensive ring craft. And mainly it involves like negating his lead hand and then kind of ultimately closing the door with counterpunching. And although Max was able to kind of figure out, hey, I can get stuff done with body punching and touching you later on, Volkanovski basically shut down most of his attempts to create pocket entries. So it was a very, very impressive performance. Cannot be said enough. Fight number two changes the whole ball game on how I think we saw Holloway, because I think going into it, basically everyone was like, well, Volkanovski kind of figured you out already, so what are you going to do differently? It's probably going to be competitive again, but like what's going to happen? And I think the thing that makes that fight so fascinating is that Holloway goes in and has this completely different like strategic approach for how things work. So he basically realizes, okay, these are the things Volkanovski is going to take advantage of. How do I not lose any of the utility of what I was doing before, but create different utility out of it to get success? Well, taking advantage of what you know about me. And that's what he did, like using a lead hand still effectively to create different kind of things, distractions, taking a different stance to bait Volkanovski in, et cetera, et cetera. And that kept him consistently in the fight throughout it. And Volkanovski, to his credit, like made adjustments, but like they were still going back and forth by the end. And like, I don't really think either guy truly figured the other out by the end. But the really, really interesting part of that fight goes back to just how the preparation goes. Because it kind of sets this interesting kind of question of whether or not like, okay, so is Holloway looking at his future contests now with this kind of like new strategic kind of idea in mind as a precedent, like taking advantage of opponents' weaknesses to allocate his game plan around beating them? Or is this just a Volkanovski specific thing because he's already been in there with him? And I'm not sure there's a clear answer to that, because on one hand, it's very impressive he was able to figure out Volkanovski's flaws and how to take advantage of a lot of them. But on the other hand, it's also like maybe he needs that like tactile kind of experience beforehand. So one of the most interesting questions to ask Holloway going into this is, you have Calvin Kattar, who has a clear defined like set of issues and weaknesses. Even though he's dangerous in specific areas, can Holloway take advantage of those things? And I think that's one of like the main central questions to ask. And realistically, there's no answer, and we're not going to know till we see it, but it might be the most intriguing thing for this matchup.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely where I was headed with that whole build up. So thank you for filling that in nicely. And yeah, I'm wondering, this could be a good test of Max being adaptable, because after that first Volkanovski fight, a bunch of us were sinking our expectations of who Max is as a fighter. Like, is he that predictable? Is he that, if you have a certain read on the things that he builds his game off of, can you shut him down? Can he be shut down by people who have these specific skills? We we were picking hypothetically a lot of people to beat him after that. We were super down on him. Not to a crazy degree. We were picking elite fighters to beat him, from other
Well, also
organizations.
Edson Barboza.
Yeah, Edson Barboza always. Not really, but kind of. Not me.
Somewhat.
That was a huge blow up. We'll get to that some other day. But yeah, we were down on him, and then, like you said, the Volkanovski fight, he adapted like brilliantly. So he looked like a very, very smart fighter, especially after he set the bar so low in the build up to the fight, being like, oh, like just saying dumb fighter things and like, oh yeah, I didn't train or I didn't spar, and like did all my training over Zoom, and we're like, oh no, Max. And then he comes up and has one of the best performances of his career, albeit loses the decision, but I think everyone agreed he looked fantastic and it was an amazing fight. And then Volk also was adapting during the fight, so just all sorts of great things. So you pose the question yourself, you're like, is this Max being adaptable, or is it just because he fought Volkanovski twice? And he said, okay, I know what he does. Does he need that much data before he can make adjustments, or can he do it leading into a fight? Just repeating what Dan says, really, because he's so smart. So I guess one specific place where that could show up is like counterpunching. So Calvin Kattar isn't like known as a counterpuncher, but it's definitely one of his most dangerous skills, I would say. And I feel like it comes up, and Sriram, you can jump in because you're a hardcore Kattar studier. But I feel like it comes up mostly with straight punching. I just remember, I think in clips, so I'm thinking of clips of him like coming off the center line, and like ripping the body or going like 1-2 slip body, things like that. But that's when he tends to get off like his prettiest work, is off his opponent's straight punching at a range he's comfortable with. So theoretically, I think it's totally possible that we see him get those kinds of opportunities against Max. I think it's pretty likely that he lands in that fashion. So could this be a test of Max's adaptability? Of that happens, can he vary his entries or do whatever he needs to do to adjust his game to stop that from happening? Or does he just weigh the volume against the opportunities of counters and just kind of go uphill against it?
Yeah, I think there are a couple questions here in terms of so the things that we know about Max in terms of classical Max, what he tends to do is the jab and the body work. And I think as tricky as the jab is, the body work is pretty accessible against Kattar for the high guard and being as tall as he is, because Max had to like go all the way down with Edgar and Volkanovski. So if he were to tune his approach towards body work, that would be an interesting change for me to see. But more interestingly, I think what we looked at in Edgar and Volkanovski 1, that is the last 2 times he faced new opponents who he didn't have concrete reads on, he relied very heavily on the jab. And I think the fact that Edgar was able to get away with cross-countering Holloway fairly consistently, like not super consistently, but consistently enough that it was like a thing in the fight, a dynamic, I think that's pretty concerning against Calvin Kattar for 2 reasons. One, Kattar's probably a better counterpuncher than Edgar at this stage. And 2, he's more powerful, and range parity is probably rougher for Max in terms of what he relies on for defense. We saw against Dustin Poirier, a lot of Max's defensive options, they tend to be just leaping back. He's not great at angling off when someone blitzes at him. When it comes to ring craft, he's brilliant. He's absolutely fantastic. But when it comes to dealing with those blitzes, he's kind of subpar, which is why someone like Volkanovski and Poirier was able to blitz in his direction. And I think range parity makes that pretty rough in terms of Max not really having proactive defensive measures off his own jab. So he jabs, and unlike someone like Kattar who gets in on, gets behind his shoulder on his own jab, Max kind of just like sits there and he relies on his offensive depth to like get a guy biting on a feint and then jab. But even when he jabs, he's still not taking defensive measures behind it. So the counterpunching could be very concerning. And I think even more concerning is Kattar's combination punching, because if both guys are able to jab each other, I think Kattar is the more powerful and more mechanically sound person on the inside. So the question is, does Max deal with this like he did Edgar and Volkanovski 1? Or, and we've seen so many approaches from Max in the past that it's very possible that he does something like the Pettis fight, where he's able to take advantage of Kattar, for instance, being a little bit more static positionally, a little bit less attentive positionally than Max has been in the past, where he was like shifting into outside angles and throwing straights to the body or kicking actively. I think the Pettis fight is one of the better blueprints for Max to use. I think the tricky part about taking Volk 2 is that the parallel for kicking Kattar tends to be Moicano. And I'm not that confident Max is that kind of kicker. In terms of that confident, I think he's never kicked in that specific way, in terms of kicking on the counter to take away the jab and doing those Dutchies that Moicano was doing so effectively. I think the way that Max kicked against Volk, it was still a ploy to get into the pocket. He was kicking and he was using the kick feints to get in and throw combinations. And that's a pretty big contrast to how Moicano was kicking to just take the pocket away entirely. The trouble I have with Max here is that he's pretty much, the way he fights, in pretty much every fight, he's going to be flirting with danger against Calvin Kattar.
One thing I want to touch upon is, so regarding the kicking thing. So I think a lot of people have been adamant about Max needs to kick against Kattar, but I don't really think, to touch upon what you were just talking about, that people kind of understand why it's important to kick Kattar and necessarily how guys have had success doing it. So like you said with Moicano, Moicano and Max differ in terms of kicks. So Max's kicks, usually, I think his two most kick-centric performances are probably Pettis Volk 2, and their utility is different. Versus Volk, it was kind of more of like both a sniping and control kind of tactic. Like, I keep you at a distance with this because I don't want you to control the distance at which we engage at all. But also I want to set you up at distance for these big shots in order to take you out. Whereas Pettis, it was more like attritional and like kind of disruptive as well. But it was also like built upon like all the other things he was doing, like setting up body work, continuing to control engagements, keep those engagements up. So you have two different kinds of like utility Max is shown with kicks, which differs from how guys have kicked like Kattar before. Because with Kattar, like guys typically are doing it off of manipulating his guard or like using it as a response to his jab. And most of the guys that have kicked him in response to his jab have gotten away with it, or at least are very consistent with it. Burgos did it, Ige did it, Stevens did it. Moicano would like hand fight out of the southpaw and use that to manipulate Kattar's like lead hand to set up those kicks downstairs. And so on. So it's like, yes, Max probably needs to apply like a kicking game here, especially to like control Kattar, but like he's probably not going to be capable of doing the exact same things Moicano did. More so, he's probably going to be focused on more about like controlling engagements and keeping Kattar at bay is the way I would see it for his kicking game, at least.
Yeah, the kicking thing is definitely a little overblown. You wouldn't know, like from an outsider perspective to our listening audience, the amount of conversations that we all have privately about all these things. It's like not even remotely close to what you see on the timeline. And one of the things we always used to fight about was, would Yair Rodriguez beat Calvin Kattar? And it's the Danny Martin, yes, definitely, and the everybody else, no, what's wrong with you? It's like, oh, well, Yair kicks a lot and he does it fast. I'm like, did you see him on the back foot versus the Korean Zombie? Like, Calvin Kattar is not a good pressure fighter, but he could do better than that. And, you know, Korean Zombie still won doing that. So things like that really, really grind my gears. But yeah, it's definitely worth talking about that Max isn't like a persistent low kicker or someone who like kicks in every combination or what have you. You kind of saw it a little bit, and like I think he uses them, you know, for utility. I mean, he has specific needs that need to be addressed, and he's like, oh, kicking could help me with that. Like the first Volk fight where his entries were getting countered with like the right hand by Volkanovski. He said, I can make my entries less predictable by he was using that low line side kick to enter into range, just hop stepping in with that, or like ending his combinations with round kicks to the body because you know, his people are getting away from him off his entries, things like that. So it's not like he's gonna be just smashing in kicks relentlessly, or maybe he will, even though it didn't work out for Jeremy Stevens, but that doesn't mean it won't work for Max. But I guess what I really like about this fight is the narrative I've been setting up in my questioning is just, I think it has the potential to answer a lot of questions about both guys, or at least about Max. If it doesn't tell us anything about Kattar, it'll definitely tell us something about Max, be it that he is who we thought he is, or he is the ideal version that we thought he could be based on this Volk rematch. And I guess let's turn the light on Calvin Kattar a little bit again. In an ideal world, what's the best you could hope for Kattar? What does his winning game plan look like? What does his win condition look like over
I
5
think,
rounds?
yeah, I mean, I think Kattar's a lot of what Kattar's success hinges on is what Max does, because Kattar's like, he just is who he is. In contrast to Max Holloway, who has several different approaches to pick from. Calvin Kattar wants those neutral, jabby exchanges that I think Max is relatively likely to give him, at least, in moderation. So Kattar's win condition is a very jabby fight. I think Max is going to have trouble with that because Volkanovski gave Max some trouble later in the rematch with that jab left hook changeup where he was able to draw Max's parry and hook around it. That's one thing that I like to see Calvin do. The counter punching, as I mentioned before, I think a fight that hinges on exchanges is pretty favorable for Calvin Kattar. In terms of the footwork and the ring craft, I think he's pretty much completely outplayed. If the fight hinges on that, he's going to have to rely on Max making a mistake. In terms of the dynamic, it probably looks closer to like Poirier 2 if he wins than Volkanovski, where instead of winning several exchanges over and over, Kattar might have to hurt him or at least limit the exchanges a little bit more, because I kind of have my doubts on Max at this stage in his career after Edgar and Volk won, whether if he's getting hurt, he's going to do the thing he did in Poirier 2, where he just keeps on coming harder and harder and harder, being like, okay, I can't get volume off without getting hurt. I have to put more volume on you over and over and over. I think he might just try to sit back, which is more favorable for Calvin Kattar, in my opinion, if he's able to limit the exchanges a little bit. So, yeah, I mean, I think if there's one thing that Kattar needs specific responses to in this fight, that he actually is in a position to deal with in like one count, it'll be the body work, because we've seen him deal with a big body puncher before, right? We saw him deal with Shane Burgos, but he also kind of struggled with it in the second round. He's able to like block it with his elbow sometimes and counter punch, but some specific responses to that would be nice. Yeah, beyond that, it's kind of just what Max does. I think it's, we're going to get into picks soon, but I think it's winnable for Calvin Kattar.
So I had, besides the question of like Max's strategical changes, I had 2 other like primary questions about this fight. We've already talked a little bit about the lead hand specifically. And I think Julian's video does a great job talking about like the kind of games like both guys kind of put behind their jabs. But I do want to talk about kind of how they differ, because I think how Kattar and Max work in terms of like building momentum is a little similar, because depending upon their success, like the more success they have, usually the more they can build off of it. And so like when you see Kattar be able to get his jab going, he starts putting stuff together, and that's where he starts really putting it on guys. And same with Max, if he's touching you, he's constantly like doing stuff. Where their jabs differ though, I think is kind of in utility, because I would say Kattar's is like the more offensively dynamic, powerful one in how he uses it. Whereas I think Max's is more capable in like situations outside of that. So the question for like lead hands is really, really interesting to me. And I think like whoever's able to build momentum, if we see a pocket heavy battle, it's going to really come down to that kind of thing. What gives me a little cause for concern, however, is kind of like answers to when both guys' jabs are taken away. Because I know Max still has the ability to work the body. I know Max has been able to start putting kicks behind stuff. I know Max likes to touch with his jab and use it as throwaways more often. With Kattar, I've seen like several times now, like guys take away his jab, and usually he reaches kind of into his toolkit and kind of finds some different things to work with it. But I think like there's still like some things to be desired, because it's like sometimes his answer is usually just, I'll just go after you and try hitting you harder. Sometimes he's able to figure out that he can touch you or like fake hooks off of it, or like take advantage of guards, like I said earlier. But it is a cause for concern though, that when I've seen Kattar's jab taken away, or like guys jab with him, such as Zabit took advantage of that, that's kind of a bit of a concern for me, because I don't really know whose lead hand will be superior here or how it's going to be used. Because like Sriram said, it's going to be how like one guy approaches it and how the other guy responds. But it's kind of a question for me of when I've seen these two guys like lose their like main weapon, how they respond. And I've always seen Max kind of respond more when that like weapon is taken away. But the other thing that's interesting to me though, and I've talked to Haxerized about this before, is when it comes to like building momentum in MMA, especially, I don't, if you let a certain guy get the ball rolling, how many guys are able to really like beat Max Holloway over 5 rounds? Because it's like low key, that is a very impressive feat to do that we really don't talk about enough. Because I don't remember who said this, but I think there are 2 ways to handle Max when he gets the ball rolling, or at least stop him from getting it rolling the way he wants. You either have to make him back off and or make him think. Poirier managed to do both, but partially because Poirier has just super nuclear power and can compete in layered exchanges. And Volkanovski basically figured out that like I don't have to compete in these layered exchanges with you by taking advantage of things. So he made Max have to think to that different level. And although both guys barely won those fights, not counting the first fight with Volkanovski, it's still a testament to their ability that when he did get that ball rolling, like they were able to find ways to keep up. So for me, the question is, how many guys are able to do that? Because the other issue with Kattar that I have for this fight is how well is he going to do if the exchanges become more layered? Because I've seen Kattar like good at creating exchanges when they get into the pocket and then punctuating off of them. But what happens when those exchanges keep going? Because when I see guys go after him, sometimes he sometimes defaults to covering up and then the body shots start landing. And everyone who has tried to do that succeeds. And that's especially a problem because when he backs up, he has like a few default things. He'll either guard, which leaves the body open. He'll switch to southpaw and start trying to hand fight you to get some kind of directionality or safety. But I feel like in terms of the pocket battle, if it gets there, Kattar's chances with punctuation and willingness to fire will lead to probably some wicked competitive exchanges. But over time, like as many answers as I can see for him, I just always find 1 or 2 more for Max to like use. And I do think Kattar is a very good fighter, but I know Max Holloway is one of the best builders and best tacticians in terms of making adjustments, especially the more the exchanges happen or the more he builds flow. So it's kind of hard for me to see like Kattar winning this over 5, especially the longer it goes and the more like hypothetical body work adds up. But I don't think it'll be one-sided.
No, I don't think it'll be one-sided either. And I think how competitive it is and what kind of fight it looks like will depend on how Max approaches it, because Kattar tends to want every fight to be the same way, where it's, kind of a mid-range where he can, maybe you try to pressure him a little bit, but, he has his time to, relax and get his space and do what he wants to do and kind of, manage the mid-range and come in and out as he pleases. And then if you enforce something on him, that kind of changes how it goes. Where with Max, he's probably best when he's pressuring. I think that's pretty safe to say. But he doesn't always do it. So I brought up the Frankie Edgar fight. That's a fight where it made sense to me for him to pressure, but he didn't. So I feel that in this fight, it's kind of the same case where I understand completely the hesitation to pressure hard in both the Edgar fight and this fight. In the Edgar fight, because it opens you up to reactive shots a little bit more with Edgar's takedown game, or power punching, which could be a thing. With Kattar, the big threat is getting punched hard in the face, and the harder you pressure, the higher percent chance that you might get punched hard in the face in the early going. But based on everything both of you are saying about Kattar's game, the wheels are going to start to come off. Like the weaknesses are going to start to come out more if he pressures him, if he puts it on him early. So I think very quickly into the fight, within the first couple minutes, we're going to know what kind of fight it's going to be. And, best case scenario of it being a blowout is kind of a rough first couple minutes, but then Max gets all the reads he wants and Kattar, becomes uncomfortable. And then that goes in his direction versus, being more patient and taking his time. It's going to be a much closer fight for longer, until there's a breaking point in either direction. Is that a fair premise?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds right to me. I think the worry that I have with assuming that Max is going to make all the reads is like, yeah, Kellen Kattar he's strategically one note, and if something like something like Andre Fili going southpaw a lot kind of made Kattar visibly uncomfortable, which is something that you could see Max trying to like work with. But also, I can't really move past how he looked in that Edgar fight, because it's like the last time he's faced that and Volk one, like the last time he faced an opponent who he didn't have a ton of information on, like in terms of fighting them before. And neither was a particularly adaptive fight in terms of strategy, more in terms of tactics. Like if you saw the Volkanovski one, you saw Max turn to hitting the body a little bit more in these exchanges and kicking, and he switched to southpaw, but I think that was more a thing of Volk killing his lead leg from orthodox for the first couple rounds. So I think Max didn't change the way that he fought in terms of pressuring Volk. He changed what he did inside that framework. And I think that's the kind of fight in which Calvin Kattar excels, because if you look at a fight like Shane Burgos, Burgos put a lot of pressure on him. He did a lot of jabbing. He did a lot of kicking. And I think Kattar, he likes that kind of fight where someone lets him go in and out at will. And I'm not sure Max is necessarily the guy to take that strategy away from him as much as it is a guy who might beat him on the tactics within it. So I think, like, for example, the Edgar fight, right? Edgar was able to blitz in and out, and he was punished for it in the clinch, but he also wasn't really taken away from that, if that makes sense. Like, Max didn't pressure him hard or draw him forward with any kind of defined strategy. He just kind of fought in neutral. He jabbed, he tried to draw out responses and kick. He did his thing, but I think that kind of fight is the kind that gets him in trouble against someone more powerful in a range parity. I mean, I think it's a tricky fight. And if Max is able to get all those reads off Kattar's jabbing and his counterpunching, it's very winnable for him, because Max could just win Kattar's fight on Kattar's terrain. It's very possible. Max, like, as much as we're talking about Kattar being more powerful on the inside and very capable, Max is too. And Max is probably the smarter guy in terms of tactics, as smart as Kattar is in terms of tactics on the inside. And I think Max he's a justified favorite in terms of how many strategic options he has, because I don't think the kicks is what's going to do it. I think it's the outside footwork that's going to annoy Kattar if Max goes towards that strategy. Because, guys like Lamas and Stevens tried to kick, but it was Zabit and Moicano who extended the range and made Kattar chase them. And I think it's very doable for Max to do that. My question is, at this point in his career, is Max particularly likely to move away from what he does best or what he's most comfortable doing against an opponent against whom it may work? Because we saw against Volkanovski, it did not work, and then he switched to something else. Is it, this is my first fight against Kattar. I think I'm way better than him. I'm going to do my thing. And combined with all the damage that he's taken recently and Kattar just having a little bit more of a margin in terms of durability, I mean, I'm pretty much just being a contrarian because everyone else is picking Max, but I'm going to go with Kattar.
Dan, last thoughts about this matchup, because I'm going to move on after this one.
Okay, so another thing I wanted to think about usually with this is a question of I'll play a bit of some devil's advocate, because although like I am gonna pick Max, I am gonna say some things that I can see Kattar having some success with. I don't think Kattar's outside game is particularly good, but one thing he tends to surprise guys with is, like, if they come in on him, he sometimes times front kicks down the middle very well. He catches guys very consistently with that and then cracks them pretty hard. He has success working guys around their guard, but especially if they sits. And for all intents and purposes, Holloway is not like, say, Jeremy Stevens, Dan Ige, etc., in terms of like head movement and active guard. But like usually when Holloway's instinct is to look on the inside, like he's trying to extend it. So he'll often try to parry first before moving his head as his first instinct. Sometimes like he'll hop back because he wants to elongate the exchange, but it can kind of get him in trouble if like the other guy wants to pursue or is capable of pocket boxing too. So that kind of thing might help Kattar out here, because like both guys kind of tend to fight on a bit of a straight line with the center line in particular. And I think Max is more capable of working around, but I think like on the inside, Kattar is probably superior, or at least is kind of tighter, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think what this fight's going to come down to is, I think we've already established it. It's just it's a matter of like what Max is going to do to control engagements, whether or not he can win the engagements when they happen, and for Kattar, like what kind of engagements are going to favor him, who's going to build momentum if those engagements happen. And I think a lot of those things we really won't know until we see them happen, which makes it inherently fascinating. Although I am going to say I expect this to be a competitive fight, I understand why some people do think it might be a blowout for Max. Yeah, Max, in terms of like, but I see that happening down the road, probably like round 2 onwards, because I think early on it'll probably be competitive because like both guys will try to figure each other out. As for like a potential like knockout or like Kattar hurting Max, I don't think I can buy that until I see it, although I totally think it's plausible because at some point damage will catch up to guys. It's just like how it'll probably catch up with Poirier one day, it'll catch up with Gaethje, it'll catch up with everyone, but and it will catch up with Max eventually. But I kind of feel like I need to see those things to believe it, but it's not something that you should ignore. But I feel like ultimately just how I see this fight is just, as I've already outlined, I think it's just versatility and tactics that will take over the fight as it goes on, and just having more answers. But I'm very excited to see this. It should be really good.
Yeah, it's if you couldn't tell by the the entire podcast, we have more questions than predictions for sure, and I think that makes it a really interesting fight to watch. Like, I'm very much looking forward to seeing what happens, and I'm also excited to watch it with Sriram because we haven't done a live commentary together in a while, and it's always really fun.
Events.
And then we always share the same brain during it and end up having the exact same takes. But then Sriram goes rogue and on another podcast says that Fig Moreno was less competitive than Fig Joe V1. Just the first round. He qualified it, but that is not a take we agreed on from the commentary.
That's very true.
Although
we also didn't watch Fig Benavidez together, so
that's true. That's true. It's too sad. But yeah, so I'm super interested in watching it, and I think the point of, if you want to go like minimalist analysis, Max is really, really durable. He is deeper as a fighter. They're going to strike, so he'll probably win. And so if you want to go with like the least amount of thought possible, I would favor Max. If you want to go with the most amount of thought possible, which we've been doing this whole week, it still seems like a favors Max. So that doesn't mean something that we didn't expect can't happen, and maybe we'll look stupid, or maybe it's something we couldn't have predicted.
Possible.
Let's find out.
Listen, guys, if Jose Aldo at like being a mummy can wage a competitive fight against Piotr Jan the way he did, then like some things, crazy things can happen.
For sure. Speaking of mummies, the co-main event is old people, is one way to say it. They're actually, I mean, in actual human years, they might not be that old. Carlos Condit is 36 years old, which you're like, okay, that's pretty old for MMA. And Matt Brown is 40. And you're like, yeah, that's really old for MMA. But then you realize that they've had, like, Matt Brown has had over 40 fights, and Condit has had over 40 fights. So that's a lot. That's a lot of damage. They both have not been, it's the flex tape commercial. It's a lot of damage though. And neither of them have been super defensively responsible for any part of their careers. So you cringe when they're still fighting at this point. You wish they wouldn't, but they are. So you're kind of glad they're fighting each other, right? If fighters who are super deep in their careers and definitely past it are going to keep fighting, they should fight each other because that's probably safer, maybe. Or is it worse because now you have two people who are extra vulnerable to take life-altering damage instead of one in the matchup. But the
It's also
mismatch
kind of
more
less useful
Oh yeah,
because if two guys are old, then you kind of want them both to lose because then they might retire. And
speak
then
for
if you give them
yourself.
to someone young,
I
then
want
they
them
get
both to
like
win, Sriram.
that's never gonna happen though.
The fans want to win. Anyway, I think it's important to discuss the way in which each of them are old. Some might say shot or washed, but that doesn't look the same for every fighter. You know what I mean? It's different case by case, the way in which they get old. For example, usually it means that their chin goes. That didn't happen with Carlos Condit yet. However, it's also important to notice that his losing streak is all grapplers. It's just him getting grappled every time. It's the Lawler fight, which some people thought he won. I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion on that. And then Damian Maia, that is an acceptable way to get grappled. Neil Magny, less acceptable, but I could see Prime Condit getting taken down a bunch by Neil Magny. So it's not like that's that out of the ordinary. Alex Cowboy, that's a little worse. But again, he is very strong, and it starts to suggest that the way that Condit is regressing is like frailty, and he's becoming less physically capable. His
He's
body
worse at
is
the
not,
things that he used to be bad at. So it's like
it's
normal.
never like he was like super strong or anything, but he was always very athletic and physical, albeit janky. So his body's starting to slow down a little bit. You're like, okay, this makes sense for him to lose this way. And Chiesa also grappled him. So you only really have evidence if you don't watch the fights, because I don't remember what happened in them, because I'm not going to rewatch those fights. You really only have evidence of one area of decline, essentially. And I think in the Chiesa fight, he was still actually fairly competitive off of his back,
Yeah,
which
he
is
won round one
interesting.
off his back.
Which is interesting. And then he beat Court McGee, and I probably watched it. No, I don't think I did watch it. I didn't watch it because I haven't seen Holm versus Aldana, so I doubt I watched the undercard.
Yeah, it was kind of weird because it kind of looked like Condit was about to check out after the first couple minutes of round one, and then he dropped McGee at the end of round one with like a big shot. I don't remember what it was because I also haven't watched it since. Gotcha. But he dropped McGee at the end of round one, and after he was like, "Oh, I actually want to be here," and he started actually doing a bunch of other things. But it was also kind of a weird thing because McGee kind of fought like he didn't know who Carlos Condit was. McGee probably could have just leaned on him on the fence a lot more than he actually did, but he just fought in space, which was bizarre. So he didn't look better at the stuff that he was bad at.
You went stand and bang. Speaking of standing and banging, so then you have Matt Brown. And listen, so for Condit, he has a big losing streak. So you're like, yeah, if you're a casual fan, because you have to be selling this to people who aren't paying a whole heck of a lot of attention, just because if they've been watching the fights, I don't know why they'd be excited about this. I know some people who are good fans who are not excited about it, but like, yeah, I want them to fight just because it's going to be like, oh, they're going to smash together a bunch, because they know them well, but they have what they like. That's okay. But if you're trying to sell Matt Brown as someone who's still vaguely relevant, his losing streak doesn't look terrible, besides that he lost to Jake Ellenberger. But like you have like, he fought Robbie Lawler in that 5-rounder, really good fight. Then he gets wrestled by Johnny Hendricks. Whatever, that happens. He beats Tim Means, cool win. Damian Maia again, fine, totally cool. Jake Ellenberger, okay. But Jake Ellenberger did exploit his biggest weakness, which is his kickable, fragile body, and he kicked him in it. And the Cowboy fight, I think, was kind of competitive for a little bit, and then they hugged, and he lost his edge. And then that's exactly how it happened. And then Cowboy kicked him in the head, murdered Diego Sanchez, which doesn't mean anything at all, and then murdered Ben Saunders. So he's done a couple murders. And then Miguel Baiza, I don't know how to say that, but I think they had like a competitive fight where they did action. So it's like, okay, like Matt Brown is still a reliable action fighter. He can still do some serious damage. He's still in there, competent, doing his thing. So you could say that. And then with Condit, you're like, on the feet, he's not really, inept. Like, he's still watchable. He could still beat fighters if they only strike with him. So neither of them are even remotely close to their primes. Not even like, I would say a husk is too much of a compliment, but they can do things. They work. It's not like Diego Sanchez who can basically do nothing at this point. They're not that level of shot. So I felt that whole rant was necessary just to put in perspective the kind of washed up that they are. It's not just they old, not gonna watch. It's like, okay, this could be sort of a fight. It won't mean anything, but it could be a fight. So I'm sure you guys have a ton to say about this one. So go ahead, Dan. I know you've been holding it
All right. All right. So, oh man, we sometimes wish years would just go back. And I have to imagine if this was like 2013, 2014, it's hard to really think of a more violent fight on paper MMA could have had back then. And I mean that sincerely. Yeah, it would have been amazing probably from like 2013, 2016, but alas, we live like 5 years later or something because I can't do math. And we have Matt Brown, who used to be frailty is thy ribs, Ibs versus Condit, is his alien head still intact kind of thing. Which, speaking of which, holy freaking shit, is Condit's chin insane. If you have watched his whole career, it makes no sense. And for some reason, I decided to rewatch the first round of the Woodley fight the other day, and literally Woodley hits him with like the cleanest right I have ever seen in my life. And Condit's head literally teleports, and he's like fine, and it makes no freaking sense. And then there's like the final 2 minutes of the Lawler fight, which I don't know what other welterweight would have survived that, but hey, I guess Condit's head is made of some like unfathomable substance material that probably comes from the same dimension that where Usman gets his gas tank or something. I don't know. Yeah, so at this point, this is sad, and man, I wish we had like time magic and stuff, but you know, hopefully they have something fun. Maybe it's not as sad as like a Shogun Little Nog 3, but it's still kind of like hopefully we get something out of it, and hopefully both guys look at least decent. But we'll always be fans of these two just because of what they've succeeded. But hopefully they both retire or something. But hopefully it's a last hurrah. It's they're both like great fighters, and we love them to death. And hopefully like they secretly de-age and we get something amazing. I don't know. But hey, if it had happened a couple of years ago, would have been way cooler, is all I'm saying. Because then they would have gotten into like Fry Takayama elbow exchanges or something, and it would have been amazing. Okay, not really. But Condit probably would have won because he's in fucking destructible or something. Or it would have been at least super violent. I don't know. It's just it's kind of sad, but you know, we'll still cheer for them regardless, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I was never a huge Condit guy, and he was fun, obviously, but Condit wasn't really my cup of tea, I guess. I'm not British, so that doesn't really work. But Condit wasn't really my thing.
Indians drink tea, Sriram.
Yeah, but I'm
Learn
in
your own
America.
culture.
Indians threw tea into the harbor. No way. But yeah, Condit wasn't really my thing. His striking was always very smart, like in a certain sense, and that he could see a vulnerability and kind of rip it to pieces. But those weird blitzing raids and the takedown defense just not existing. On the other hand, Matt Brown was someone that I always liked a lot. The Eric Silva fight, especially, which was just all of Brown's flaws in the first minute and everything great about Matt Brown in the next 2 rounds. So this is weird because Carlos Condit is still. I have some questions about his chin because he actually did get hurt pretty badly by that upkick from Alex Oliveira. Oliveira like kicked him right in the face, and Condit was pretty much dead after that and got guillotined by Alex Oliveira. So that's some bad news. But I think Condit's probably still the more durable party because the upkick didn't actually kill him, and we can't say the same about the left hook that Baez landed on Brown in that last fight. That said, Brown is still foot sweeping people. I think he foot swept Ben Saunders, and he is going to foot sweep Carlos Condit and lay on him forever. Let's go Brown.
Yeah, I didn't bother to actually try to figure out how the fight was going to go, but that would be interesting. I hope he doesn't do that. It's funny, they definitely put this as the co-main event just because of the name value, because they're both so well known. But the more interesting fight below that is the return of Santiago Ponzinibio, I thought that would never happen. I thought he was done for real.
I still don't believe it's going to happen.
It was November 2018, which honestly feels a lot more recent than it was. Like I thought it'd been 10 years since his last fight. And what's funny is his win streak didn't age that poorly. Like usually when a guy's been out for 3 years and like today, like it doesn't look as good anymore. Like who are these people? I mean Gunnar Nelson, which is I'm not gonna make excuses for the Gunnar Nelson fight because all of his fights have the same excuse where Ponzinibio has poked every single one of these people in the eye. So I can't say just because he poked Gunnar Nelson in the eye, that one doesn't count. You have to say his whole career doesn't count. So he's poked everyone in the eye. But yeah, Gunnar Nelson and Neil Magny are still relatively relevant. And I've always thought highly of Nordine Taleb. So I think that's a good win. And Mike Perry has been good in a couple fights. Is how I will say that.
Strickland's doing well now.
Strickland's doing well. That was a while ago. So he still has some relevant wins in the mix. Although, do they mean as much since they were before or whatever? Probably not. But he's if he came back in and got a win over like an active welterweight who was winning fights in this division, it would be a good sign. I never thought super highly of him. I always thought he was kind of like a power puncher with a good 1-2 and a low kick, which might be exactly what he is. I'm not positive. I haven't studied him. And Li Jin Liang, he's fighting, I thought he was going to be, well, I don't know. I never know how to appropriately evaluate Neil Magny because I always think he's less good than he is just because I don't really enjoy his style. But
let me do it.
Oh, you want to evaluate Neil Magny?
No. Neil Magny has this magical power where people keep clinching with him for no reason.
Yes.
It's pretty cool.
Yes. And him and Li Jin Liang wrestled a decent amount in their fight. And Li Jin Liang out-wrestled him in the first round, which was interesting. But they just kept doing it. And eventually wrestling with Neil Magny and clinching with him gets very tiring. And then he beats you at it, which is that Tony Martin fight, or Rocco Martin. Sorry, he changed his name. That was a silly one where Rocco Martin was winning when they weren't clinching, and then he clinched with them, and he just kept doing it until he was losing. It's not that simple, but it kind of is in a way. So Neil Magny's a weird one, but Li Jin Liang beat Eliseu Zaleski dos Santos, and ZDS didn't look great in that fight compared to how he's looked in other fights, but Li Jin Liang looked kind of good in that fight. And he also looked kind of good against David Zawada, who isn't great or anything, but he's been improving a lot. Li Jin Liang is. So I thought he might turn into someone who's pretty interesting just because he's like pretty athletic, like very physical, hits hard, like is kind of crazy with the way he fights. If you remember his older fights, he's the crazy swing in the pocket guy, just lots of pocket hooking. and it worked for him a decent amount, which there's a degree of attributes necessary to make that happen. So I thought he might be kind of an interesting fighter. So losing to Neil Magny doesn't deter my interest that much, I would say. So this fight might actually be kind of cool just because Ponzinibio likes to punch people hard in the face and Li Jin Liang likes to punch people hard in the face. So I assume one of them will succeed.
I mean, I think one weird thing about Li Jin Liang is that he's kind of like, I need to get dropped to get going type fight. I think he got dropped by David Zawada early in the fight, or at least he got badly hurt. And then he ended up, what's that?
I said, oops.
Yeah, but, and then he ended up beating him with like a side teep or something like that, like right to the body, which is pretty cool. Him starting slow might be bad against Ponzinibio coming back like in prime form. But also, I kind of expect Ponzinibio to just like not know what he's doing for the first round at least. He's been out for 3 years. I think Ponzinibio started putting it on Magny from like the very beginning. So if that happens here, it could be pretty rough. But it might just be like Ponzinibio being very nervous but still winning for like the whole thing, and like oh, Ponzinibio's done as a contender, but he's still like an action fighter, which is kind of how I feel about Li Jin Liang after Neil Magny. Because if you lose to Neil Magny, you're not a contender, but you can still be fun. Winner loses to Tony Martin.
Hold on, I had something prepared for that statement in response. If you lose to Neil Magny, not a contender. Darn. That these all make sense. I'm looking at his record. I was like, oh, Johnny Hendricks, not a contender, but yeah,
He wasn't after that.
after he beat him, Kelvin Gastelum.
Was he? Okay, yeah, fine.
That
But
was
also, that was
2015.
supposed to be a draw. That should have been a draw, though.
Right, that's the only one. That's the only one I can come up with. I thought there was gonna be more. Like, surely he has. I thought he had some wins in his pocket that were like, all right, I'm gonna get you with that one, but I did not.
I still want Tony Martin to do well, but he lost to Neil Magny, so he is doomed.
As Dan pointed out, that was due to magic and shouldn't be held against him.
I'll take it. He did beat Damian Maya, so.
That he did. Dan, do you have interest in Li Jingliang versus Santiago Ponzinibio, or just passive?
My serious answer is I have not studied Santiago Ponzinibio enough, and literally did not find out he was fighting till literally like 13 hours ago or something. And even then, Jinx, he's gonna probably die of heart failure and not show up or something because he's cursed. And I like to think dark thoughts. But assuming both guys show up, we have of course forgotten the real important meat of this fight, which is the eye poke war. Because today it is finally time for us to truly embrace the power of finally getting an MMA fight with nonstop fouls, because that is what we deserve. And so who tears the other guy's eye out first wins basically a bonus of 50K is the new UFC rule for this fight, hopefully.
My money's on Ponzinibio. Jin Liang eye pokes out of desperation. Ponzinibio eye pokes out of pleasure.
Yeah.
There's a difference. It's obsession.
No, sincerely. Yeah, I'm not prepared to talk about this fight in detail because I have not watched either guy enough, sincerely. But I hope it's hilarious.
What I will say is that other Danny was super into Ponzinibio for a second, and then he just stopped doing anything whatsoever. And Danny was like, "Oh, Ponzinibio actually kind of bad." So yeah, he's pretty much just a one. That's what I've seen, 1-2 on a low kick, but that was enough to beat the crap out of Neil Magny. So clearly he's doing something right.
He has a good 1-2 and a good low kick.
Very true. Didn't he get grapple fucked at some point? I feel like
dude. Why would I have rewatched the fights of a guy that I didn't expect to ever fight again? It's unfair. Unfair to expect that from me.
Might have been Ryan LaFleur. Was it Ryan LaFleur? I don't know. I don't watch Ryan LaFleur fights.
He had maybe. Anyway, so there are other fights on this card. We don't have to actually talk about them. I'm just going to name them. Joaquin Buckley, who is the meme kick man, probably going to win. I didn't check, but I assume he won knockout of the year by pretty much every major outlet because it was ridiculous. And Impa Kasangane is actually kind of good in a way. So the knockout is slightly meaningful. We talked about this a lot last week. I shouldn't talk about it again. He's fighting Alessio De Chirico, who is Italian. And that is very important that he's Italian to me and to my friend Al Zulino. And all I remember is that this guy is from Rome. He's Roman, and everyone's like, "Oh, you're a gladiator." He said, "I'm not a gladiator. I'm a knight." So the specific subset of Italian culture he subscribes to is the Christian era. So he's more into the Crusades than the Roman Empire, which is probably a poor choice. But it's more power to him. Knights are of a higher social class, so he's definitely doing some classism with his Italian culture references. But he's on the 3-fight losing streak, which is why
he's not very good.
Why is he in this matchup against exciting meme man that they're trying to sell? I guess maybe they just picked a guy. They're like, "Oh, you want to come back fight the guy who we're trying to build." He lost to Kevin Holland, which has aged better than expected. Mahmoud Muradov, who is actually kind of good, and Zach Cummings, who I think is pretty functional, despite looking like he should be very, very bad. So it's not the worst 3-fight losing streak in the world. He also beat Julian Marquez before that, who's decent as well. So I think the 3-fight losing streak is a little bit misleading. Joaquin Buckley does a lot of good stuff, and he does it very hard and athletically. So I think it's a rough matchup if you are not super sound or durable. And I'm not positive if he is either. He has never been knocked out, so maybe it'll be a good fight. I don't know. Then before that, we have Punahe Soriano versus Dusko Todorovic, which is a dope name. Both dope names. I've definitely watched Soriano. He's a Contender Series guy, so I think he's like Contender Series guys where he has some good offense, and that's the end of it. I think that's the general premise there. And then on the prelims, we have Ryan Wagner's favorite fighter, Nasruddin Imavov, who is I don't know where in the Caucasus he's from, but a Caucasian fighter out of France. I think he's a grappler, and that's all I know about him. He's fighting Phil Hawes, who they've been trying to make Phil Hawes happen for like 5 years. Do you remember that? It's been a while.
Isn't that the John Jones's teammate guy?
John Jones' former training partner, like might have been on like a wrestling team with him or something like that.
He was on like Contender Series 5 times, finally impressed, and then knocked out the.
They tried to do
Whittaker's
him
teammate.
on The Ultimate Fighter. They tried to do him on the Contender Series. They've been trying that one out for a while. And I believe Julian Marquez, who I just talked about, head kicked him on the Contender Series. I can't predict that matchup at all. I have never heard of these women's bantamweights, Wu Yanan versus Joseline Edwards.
I've heard of her. She would my nan.
Jeez.
That's awful.
That's pretty good,
That's the worst.
actually.
No, that's awful.
Once I thought about it.
I think this was supposed to be Best Correa's retirement fight, and then some rando filled in. So.
Oh, it's unfortunate. I really wanted Betch to retire. And then we have the heavyweights, Carlos Felipe versus Justin Tava. I've heard of Justin Tava. I think he trains out of Tiger Muay Thai or, City Kickboxing. He's from them parts. I can't specify. Here's one that's kind of relevant. Maybe David Zavada versus Ramazan Emaev, and they're kind of good, right?
Yeah, Mead is like he's kind of the Magomedov mold where he throws like one strike every round. That Ryan likes him for that reason. And Zavada, I don't remember much about his game, but he gave some guys a competitive fight. He gave Jin Liang a competitive fight, and I think he choked out that Nurmagomedov guy, one of the bad ones.
His I think like the one that is actually closest related to Khabib.
Ooh.
The PFL one. He triangled him in the first round, in fact. So relatively interesting. I think I actually watched David Zavada in KSW. I used to watch KSW and saw him fight there, and he's a decent grappler. So that fight could be interesting. Sarah Morris versus Vanessa Mello. I don't know them. Well, I do know Sarah Morris, but I don't really know her. And then I believe a debuting featherweight, Jacob Kilburn. Don't know you. Austin Lingo. I think he fought Yusuf Zalal. Is that right?
I think Kilburn was the one who lost to Billy Quarantillo, right? Wasn't he?
Oh, did he?
I feel like he did.
Heck if I know, dude. It's been too much. So I mean, I've been watching MMA since 2010-ish, like summer 2010, and for most of that time, I would say like 6 or 7 out of those 10 years or 11 years now, I tried to watch everything, every UFC fight, every Bellator fight, every fight I could get my hands on. I watched all of it, and I am super, super duper burnout. So I do not watch the entirety of every card anymore. So I do miss out on some things. So if you're an extreme card watcher and you're like, how don't you know these people? They've been on 4 fight night prelims. I'm like, I'm sorry. I've missed it. So
You're referring to Fano, right?
Yes.
We're all a la carte fans.
Yeah, I'm an a la carte fan. Simon. Shout out to Simon too. He watches the Bellator prelims. I only watch the Bellator prelims when there are wrestlers I know who are fighting, but
Utter psychopaths. Reminds me of my teaching career.
yeah. So that's that whole card. I think we have talked a lot about it, and I am ready to be done talking about it. What else is going on?
I only care about Kattar Holloway, honestly.
Yeah. What else is going on? Do we have anything else to plug, disclose, confess to?
There's the Chiesa Magni card. I know you guys are hyped about that.
Nah.
Yeah. I mean, that used to have Rivero Munoz too, and then they moved that to a different card, so I can just skip that card.
Well, we'll talk about it next week. Because we know we have to do another podcast next week.
Yeah, I mean, sure.
It might just be us recapping Holloway Kattar for the entire time.
And also Poirier and McGregor, which matters more.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll talk about stuff. Dan, do you have things to promote or Sins to confess.
If
I
you
don't
want to
know.
rate my ridiculously long stuff, you can find my Twitter account. I recently wrote a two-parter of Volkanovski Holloway 1 and 2, and I think I did okay. I have no idea. I'm just waiting for someone to tell me
Very
it's
good.
shit. Oh, thank you.
I'll tell you it's bad if you want me to. I'd be lying though.
Wow. I did tell Lukash to tell me if it was bad, or Hex, one of them, because they know they can hurt my feelings or can't. I don't know. Yeah, Poirier McGregor's very interesting. I'm trying to come up with devil's advocate ways for Poirier to maybe win that, and I might just post some threads writing another article anytime soon, unless I get bored, which happens frequently, and I'm just insane or something. I don't know.
Cool. Sure.
I've ran out of jokes.
Yeah, this is really fizzled. I have nothing to plug. Let's just get
Okay.
this over with.
Well, I'm studying for standardized testing to get into grad school, so I'm not writing for Bloody Elbow for a couple months. So don't look for my articles if you did look for them before. But the podcasts will continue because they are not that hard, honestly. That's why we should definitely be hitting them weekly every time. But yeah, so just stick around for next week, I guess, and we'll talk about the fight. And look on Patreon if you're a patron. Look for our commentary on Holloway Kattar. That'll probably go up on Sunday. And yeah, it's gonna be a good fight. Talk to everybody next week.